Smite is an ability that is both simultaneously useful and useless. This is a statement that is obviously contradictory in nature, yet entirely true. How can that be, though? How is it possible that an ability like Smite can be both useful and useless at the same time? Let's talk about it. The last video I made on Smite didn't even scratch the surface of the ability's design, yet scrolling through the comment section reveals a plethora of differing opinions on the ability, which can be condensed into two main opposing viewpoints. Smite is a powerful ability as it grants you on-demand stagger that can allow your team to safely eliminate overwhelming threats. When used appropriately, it can be used to great effect both offensively and defensively, and can also allow your team to recover from mistakes or misplays much faster and more efficiently. Versus the other side of, Smite is a problematic ability due to the fact it just stuns enemies and does not do nearly enough damage, which in a game like Darktide is detrimental due to the fact that offense is the best defense. Additionally, it also teaches bad habits and encourages players to play with it in such a way that they are often more detrimental to the team rather than beneficial, often due to bad habits like smiting a general horde that would otherwise pose zero threat. The question that stands, though, is which side is correct. At the start of the video, I made a statement that I claimed as true, but the question is how and why. The answer does not lie within the game itself, but within the people who play it. There are many different kinds of players who play Darktide, and while I personally break them down into 5 different groups, for this video we will refer to 2 specific groups. They are typically referred to as the casuals and the tryhards in popular media, but I don't like the negative connotations that are associated with those names, so I will instead refer to them as the dedicated casuals and the veterans. When you look at these 2 groups, on the surface they appear to be identical. They enjoy Darktide enough to make it their main game, they put a significant amount of time into it, and have a desire to grow their knowledge and skill in order to be the best they can be. There is a difference between these 2 groups, though, which sometimes lie within their overarching goals, but primarily in their mindset and drive to achieve them. The dedicated casual players of Darktide do want to improve, but only within a specific boundary or identity they're comfortable in. It might be a specific class like Psyker or Ogryn, a specific playstyle like Tank or Support, or a specific build like Hellbore, Executioner, Stance, Veteran. Regardless of what they choose, the dedicated casual players of Darktide have a specific goal or goals in mind they want to achieve and will work tirelessly to achieve them, but they may not have a desire to grow in other aspects that are beyond them, either due to a lack of interest, lack of time, or lack of mechanical skill. When they reach a certain level of growth, they will become content with that growth and move on, sometimes to other goals to work towards, but more often than not to another separate game or activity entirely. This is not because they feel as if they have reached their personal peak of growth and physically cannot grow any longer, but because they are content with the growth they have achieved and are okay with the prospect of moving on to something else. And because of this, they have no qualms with taking shortcuts when necessary or skipping over something they deem as not worth their time. On the other hand, the veterans of Darktide want to improve in every aspect of the game possible. They pour themselves into the game in an effort to break it down bit by bit to maximize their knowledge and personal skill, and spend hours studying intricate details and seemingly minute numbers in order to find what the best truly is so that they can push their skill to the limit. Taking a shortcut of any kind would be anathema to their ideals, as such a skip would not actively teach them anything and might even detrimentally affect their pursuits. There might be a few specific things that disinterest them that they will avoid, and occasionally may one-trick something, but oftentimes they will still attempt to make an effort to understand things outside of their personal interests or niche so that their knowledge isn't impeded. Veteran players will not stop until they feel as if they have personally mastered whatever it is they are trying to master, regardless of how long it'll take. And once they gain that mastery, they will move on to a new goal to work towards and start the entire process over again. The dedicated casuals are just as invested into the game as the veteran players are. The only difference is that the veterans are willing to take certain steps to grow that the dedicated casuals are not, often stepping out of their comfort zone in order to do so. Because of this key difference, these two groups will often have differing opinions on the game because the things they find useful for their personal levels of play are completely different. In other words, the meta that evolves between these two groups is not the same. This brings us back to our opposing opinions on Smite. The dedicated casual players see an inherent value in Smite because it gives them the ability to do something they wouldn't be able to do reliably otherwise, which is to deal with key threats before they cause serious harm. This doesn't mean that they're wholly incapable of doing so themselves without Smite. Some might be, which is a small exception and not representative of the majority. It just means that they may not be at the point in their personal growth where they can reliably eliminate large amount of armored units or gunners, and Smite helps them to fill in the gaps of their skill as they slowly learn how to deal with everything. Alternatively, they may never even get the chance to build that skill due to time constraints or something more serious like a disability, and Smite helps them contribute to the team despite that. On the other hand, the veterans see Smite as a less useful ability because they, more often than not, have no direct use for it. Veterans already understand the best loadouts to use and have the mechanical skill to get the most out of them, which means they are able to handle literally whatever the game throws at them with little to no issue. For these players, Smite is worthless because it essentially just prolongs fights to an irritating degree. They can delete any enemy in their path before they even become a problem, and have the reaction time and understanding to fix mistakes they make lightning fast so that it's rarely an issue, so why would they ever need Smite? The reason Smite is both useful and useless at the same time is because it acts as a hard defensive tool that is entirely possible to outgrow the need of. Defense in a game like Darktide is absolutely necessary, but the amount of defense a specific team needs vastly depends on the players that make them up. Teams of lesser skilled players need more defensive options to help them survive, while teams of highly skilled players can forego almost all defensive options and focus primarily on offense, which allows them to steamroll matches through overwhelming damage output. If this topic sounds familiar to any of my older viewers, that's because it totally is. This is essentially the viewpoint that I and other veteran players hold of Ironbreaker, where that Ironbreaker is not useful to veterans of Vermintide because we don't need his extra tankiness and would be better off just choosing another career to maximize our damage. But that didn't mean Ironbreaker was completely worthless. Players of lesser skill could still use him to great effect, which still gave him a place among the more casual population. Now comes the difficult part. Which side should we listen to? Asking this question gets us dangerously close to the question of, should you balance Darktide top-down or bottom-up, which is an entirely different conversation to have, but at this point I feel as if we need to have it. Keep in mind that for the rest of the video, I am no longer in a neutral narrator role, but will be giving my personal opinions on the matter as a Tide veteran whose channel is primarily dedicated to the more casual player base of both games. The question of balancing top-down or bottom-up is a loaded topic because the answer really does differ depending on the context and subject at hand. I'm personally of the belief that Darktide should not be balanced with a blanket ideology in mind and should be balanced on a case-by-case basis depending on the context. And in regards to the arguments of Smite, I personally lean more towards the side of the casuals for a few reasons. First, by being a low skill floor, low skill ceiling ability, Smite is naturally accessible to lower skill players, just like Ironbreaker is in Vermintide. Regardless of why a player may be lower skill, there should always be an option for them that allows them to contribute to the team a set amount without taking their personal skill into account, or allowing the ability to partially make up for a player's lower skill. This debate gets much messier to have in reference to a PvP game, because then you have to get into the debate of if you can get as much value with a low skill thing as a high skill thing with less effort, then why bother having skill be a factor of balance in the first place? But luckily, that is not a conversation we'll ever need to have, since this is a PvE game and the AI don't particularly care. Additionally, not everything has to have major forms of skill expression or complexity. It's okay for something to be as simple as, I select it and I can use it, like Smite is. Even then, Smite has some form of skill expression via the knockdown flick tech. It's not much, but it is something. Now, to play devil's advocate with myself for a minute, does this mean that Smite should never ever receive tweaks or changes to make it better? Of course not, and there is a very real possibility that in the distant future, Smite would require a rework due to the addition of new content that causes power creep, a shifting of what kind of player primarily plays the game, a new balance direction, or anything of the sort. As a live service game, it makes sense that Darktide may not be the same game it is now a few years in the future, and would require changes of old abilities with outdated design philosophies to be brought up in line with new design philosophies. But as it stands right now, the main idea of channeled ability that stuns enemies around you is a perfectly fine ability to have in a game like Darktide, in my opinion. Second, in regards to the idea of Smite teaches people bad habits, I would like to propose a question for everyone to ponder. Does the burden of misuse lie with the player or with the given ability? Now, I do agree that it is absolutely possible to design an ability in such a way that it is inherently flawed, but an ability allowing itself to be misused or used in a less than ideal scenario is not indicative of poor design. I would argue it's more the fault of the player using the ability, and it is up to the player to learn how to use the ability, which encourages personal growth and gives people a reason to improve their skill. If you design abilities and other things with the goal to make people use them in only their most effective way, you inherently reduce player agency in your game by forcing people to use things in a specific way and limit the ability for your players to grow and express their skill, which is a huge reason why so many people love the Tide games in the first place. Now, the problem with this is that some players don't want to grow and have no desire to learn. You can't force them to, and that's perfectly fine, but how do you deal with situations like with Smite, where misuse makes people become frustrated? Well, this does not mean that small tweaks or changes can't be made to that ability in order to softly encourage players in using it in its intended way. For example, to combat the current issue that people too often smite things that are not a threat, Smite could be changed so that its number of targets and chain speed is reduced for trash mobs only, while leaving its chain speed and overall target count for elites and specials untouched. This would both gently encourage people to use Smite in an overall more beneficial way to the team without outright forcing them to do so, while simultaneously curbing the frustrations veteran players have with certain Psyker players. And this is just one way you could tweak the ability. You could do many other things, such as increasing the amount of peril Smite generates to encourage people not to use it as a main weapon, have enemies gain a brief immunity to the stun of Smite after being affected by it to encourage people to do more than just hold down their mouse button, and even more options that I haven't thought of. As a side note though, I really want to bring up the fact that these conversations and debates of balance that primarily boils down to casuals versus veterans are going to be way more common in Darktide than they ever were in Vermintide due to the fact that Darktide has no modded realm. I really think Fat Shark shot themselves in the foot by choosing to not include some version of a modded realm, as it gave the veterans a place to go and do their own thing balance-wise, which ensured that both sides got their own version of the game to play with and be happy. We don't have that in Darktide though, which means that both sides are gonna have to live with each other and give the other side what they want sometimes. Also, I know some of you watching are going to have the question of why didn't you make this video and explanation of Smite before with your first video, and while it was partially because it was the first week of classes and I was very pressed for time that week, it was primarily because I just didn't think it was time to have this conversation yet. Smite is still a relatively new ability, and I thought it would have needed a little more time with people before this topic would have cropped up, but the general response to my last video shows I was very wrong in that assumption, so this entire video is to have that conversation and set the record straight. Anyway, this video is getting more ranty than I would have liked it to be, so I will end with this. I'm of the personal opinion that Smite as a whole is a perfectly fine ability to have in the game and doesn't need a rework or base design change at this point in time. Some weapons and abilities are going to naturally be more useful to newer players, and as you grow in skill, you may outgrow the need to ever use that weapon or ability, and that's perfectly okay. However, I am of the opinion that Smite should receive some kind of tweak or minor change to help reduce the frustrations people have with Psyker players who smite everything and anything that moves. Personally, I think the best change to Smite is to implement a hard cap of effectiveness versus trash units and make Smite prioritize elite and special enemies over trash units so that Smite users can easily separate elite and special units from hordes. This would still make them useful to their team, as they'd make mixed hordes much safer to deal with, while still allowing their teammates to play the game, as most of the horde would still be running at them without being suddenly paused in place.